Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. I begin in the name of Allah, the Beneficent, the Merciful. Dear listeners, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to Friday Night Fusion. As part of Muslim History Month, this month we are, of course, in conversation tonight with Brother Firas Alkhateeb, an internationally renowned historian whose specialist studies lie in Muslim history, somebody who has studied things like the Crusades, as we talked about in the first half of this part of the show, and Muslim Spain, which we're about to talk about quite extensively. Brother Firas, Assalamu alaikum, welcome back to Friday Night Fusion.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, I'm happy to be back.
Before the break, we talked about the great Salahuddin Ayyubi, we talked about the Crusades, and another success story that we can't move away from is, of course, Muslim Spain. In fact, it's often said that some of the happiest days, some of the most prosperous years of Spain's history were during that time that it was actually under Muslim rule. What was Muslim Spain, Islamic Spain, whatever you would like to phrase it as, all about, Brother Firas?
Well, what's interesting about Muslim Spain is that we're talking about a civilization that is at the same time Islamic, it is also Western, which kind of flies in the face of the people who like to make the argument that Islam is anti-Western, that Islam itself is going to be in constant conflict with Europe or with Christianity or whatever it might be. Because what we're looking at when we're talking about Muslim Spain, we're talking about the Middle Ages. We're talking about the 800s, the 900s, the 1000s, where in Europe you had the Dark Ages, right? You had the time period when there were no cities that were greater than 50,000 people. I mean, London and Paris were little towns on the banks of a couple big rivers. There's really nothing going on in terms of large, powerful, successful empires. But we do see in the southwestern corner of Europe a flourishing civilization that was really the center of the world when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to culture, when it comes to civilization, in the 900s and the 1000s. So that's the most important thing that we need to understand when we think about Muslim Spain, is that this was the jewel of the world. And in fact, Europeans looked at Spain as being the center of the world at that time. The same way that when people talk about the greatest cities of the world today, we think New York, we think London, Tokyo, Paris, whatever it might be. At that time it was Cordoba, it was Seville, it was Granada, it was Toledo. It was these great Spanish Muslim cities that were the center of the world. And Europeans would send their children, if they were wealthy, to Spain to go and study. And in fact, here's an interesting side note, is that when people graduate, they wear the graduation robes, right? Which kind of looks very strange in a Western setting because no one actually dresses like that. But that tradition started in Muslim Spain, where Europeans would go to Cordoba to study and they would wear whatever the people over there were wearing, which is robes, which is a very interesting kind of side note. But the main point really is that Spain itself was the center of European and Islamic civilization at the same time. And the idea that a clash of cultures was going on or is inevitable between Muslims and the West is true, plainly false.
Very fascinating facts indeed, and facts that we don't often talk about when our children go to school or when we ourselves as adults do our own independent reading, our own independent thinking and historical research. These facts don't really occur to us. Now, something that Muslims are associated with nowadays, Brother Firas, is this idea that Muslims are quite inhospitable. They want to ram their religion down people's throats. They only help other Muslims. Muslim Spain, how did the leaders of that great country at the time react towards the non-Muslims that came over to study, work and live?
Oh, non-Muslims were more than welcome. And the great thing about Muslim Spain is that they had a system that modern historians, they call it la convivencia, which basically is the intermixing of Muslims, Christians and Jews in Spain. And if you look at the history, particularly of Jews in Muslim Spain, that is seen as their golden age, by far. I mean, the Jews, since, the time of Prophet Musa alayhi salam, had not had, their homeland, the promised land, which, of course, as Muslims we know was promised to Muslims as long as they follow the rule that Allah had given to Prophet Musa. But they had never had their own empire. They had never had their own state. But in Muslim Spain, that was the closest that they had ever really gotten, and that's when they established their golden age. That's when we had people like Maimonides, who I mentioned earlier, Salah ad-Din's doctor, his physician, who actually was from Muslim Spain. And the Jews had, whereas in the rest of Europe, they were persecuted, they were confined to ghettos. In Muslim Spain, they were allowed freedom, they were allowed, of course, freedom of religion, and they not only had freedom of religion, but they could prosper, just like Muslims and Christians could. So Muslim Spain is unique in that it was very culturally and religiously tolerant, unlike anywhere else in Europe at that time.
It was also way ahead other parts of Europe and other parts of the world at that time in the field of science and technology. Tell me more.
Oh, it's night and day when we're talking about, Spain versus the rest of Europe when it comes to technology. I mean, let's talk, for example, just about Cordoba itself. In the year 1000, they had, over 1 million people living in the city. And the rest of Europe, you couldn't have more than 50,000 people living in a city because of the sanitary conditions. Disease would spread and the population would die off, like we saw in the Black Plague and things like that. And when it comes to what the Muslims of Spain and also the Christians and Jews of Spain were able to create and able to invent, it's mind-blowing. Scientists like al-Zahrawi, Abul Qasim al-Zahrawi, he was a physician. He was actually a surgeon, to be specific. And the things that he invented we're still using today. The methods for surgery and even the tools for surgery, things like scalpels, things like forceps, are still used, of course, today by doctors around the world. Whereas in the rest of Europe, science and particularly medicine was seen as, kind of a half science, half witchcraft type of thing that needed to be done. It was, mind-blowingly ahead of the rest of Europe. They had, in the city of Cordoba, they had, the streets were all lit every night in 10 miles in each direction from the center of the city, which is something that, Paris and London didn't accomplish until the late 1800s with the invention of the light bulb and things like that. But in Cordoba, they were such a stable and advanced society that they actually appointed people to go out into the streets and light the lampposts every single night for 10 miles in each direction from the city center. And we're talking about, if we were to go back to that time, if we had a time machine, living in Cordoba probably wouldn't be that different from living in the West today. It would be very, very comparable, of course.
The situation you describe, the type of a civilization that you very much describe under the leadership of Muslims, sounds something that one would regard in direct contrast to the situation that the Muslim community find themselves in here today in the United Kingdom, where we talk about educational attainment, academic achievement within the Muslim community amongst our young people, unfortunately at an all-time low. How did these Muslims, these successful Muslims, manage to attain so much success, a huge amount of innovation, when the rest of the world, certainly the rest of Europe, was lagging behind?
Well, what's interesting with that is that the way that Muslims looked at science is that they saw it as part of their religion. So, for example, when Bayt al-Hikmah was founded in Baghdad in the 800s, this was a university and a translation institute and basically a research lab that was kind of seen as the center of the world of science. The Khalifa who built it, Al-Ma'mun, he declared that this institution is not just meant for science. This institution is meant for us to use science to discover the truth of Islam, which has some philosophical and theological implications as well. But the scientific implications of it means that those people who are engaged in scientific research, they're not just doing it for the sake of scientific research. They are doing it for the sake of worship. That was a form of worship. It's a form of ibadah for them. So Muslims took it a lot more seriously, whereas today, unfortunately, what we see out of a lot of Muslims and non-Muslims as well is that school is seen as a chore. It's something that's seen as a necessity that you have to do because your parents are forcing you to go to. Whereas the Muslims of that time, of course, looked at it and said, that's not what this is. What this is, it's a form of worship of Allah. And the better that we can get at science, the better we can get at worshiping Allah, the better we can get at understanding Allah and understanding Allah's creation. So it was a very religious motivation for them to go into the sciences, which of course is completely 180 degrees different from what science is today, where it's seen as atheist subject and it's anti-religion, it's anti-theology, and you either believe in science or you believe in religion. That was not the case at all for the Muslims throughout most of our history.
And it was this motivation within these individuals that very much gave them that barakah from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that allowed them to hold their name to various inventions that we use today. All the 1001 inventions that are often referred to on a regular basis, some of the things that we look at like cameras, like bars of soap, it's really amazing to think that the roots lay very much with our own Muslim community, our own ancestors in many cases.
Oh yeah, and it's something that most people don't know. When I mention it to my students, that's really kind of what gets them hooked on Islamic history. When I tell them a lot of the things that you're using on a daily basis were invented by your ancestors, and it's something that we should be proud of, and it's something that we should acknowledge and learn about. Because, we have this idea, unfortunately, and it's ingrained in a lot of our minds from a very young age, that the West is civilization and everything else just kind of learns from the West, that the West came to civilize us. Of course, that was, kind of like Rudyard Kipling's idea of, the white man's burden to go out there and civilize the West. Unfortunately, there is a seed of that in a lot of people's minds that needs to be eradicated. It needs to be completely disproven by going out there and studying Islamic history, because what we see in Islamic history is that that's not the case at all, of course. And really, if anything, the Muslim world is what helped spur the Renaissance. It certainly helped spur the Enlightenment in Europe, which is seen as the, kind of the beginning of modern civilization in Europe and the West. And we need to understand that this is actually part of a Muslim heritage, which that Muslim heritage itself is also part of the earlier Greek heritage, which is also European. So it's just a kind of constantly transforming and constantly moving stream of science and scientific advancement that has its pauses, it has its time where it advances very fast, but it's one continuous stream, and a big part of that stream is the Muslim sciences, and that needs to be acknowledged by both Muslims and non-Muslims, and it would help bring Muslims and non-Muslims closer together in terms of understanding one another instead of just seeing each other as enemies. And that's another thing that we see from Muslim Spain, is that they were not seen as enemies. They were not seen as mutually exclusive. You either live in Europe or you live in the Muslim world. No, it was the same thing.
A week has passed since we were here celebrating International Women's Day, looking at the contribution that women have made to our society, to our world over the past many years, but also recognizing some of the trials and tribulations that women continue to face globally. When we often talk about Islam and Muslims, again, one of the biggest criticisms that people try and make of our faith is that we hold our women back, we are very oppressive towards our women. Of course, all these notions couldn't be further away from the truth, but moving away from the scientific, technological, educational aspect of what we saw in Muslim Spain, how was domestic life there for Muslims during that particular time? How were women seen in society?
Oh, women were seen, of course, in a very different way from how, like you said, it's portrayed by the West, and how Islam is oppressive to women. Of course, we have the examples from the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with Khadija, who was, of course, a merchant, for example, right? And she was not, oppressed by Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam in any way, of course, and in fact, she was actually his boss, right? So even going away from the prophetic example, alayhi salatu wasalam, we have examples of other Muslims, particularly in the west of the Muslim world. Speaking of Al-Andalus and of Morocco, which are very closely related historically, we see women like Fatima al-Fihri, who established one of the first universities in Islam in Morocco, the University of Qarawiyyin. And we see that, of course, women, like you said, were not oppressed in Islamic history, and the Islamic example shows us how women ought to be treated. We don't see that at all. In Muslim Spain, for example, you had women who were some of the greatest poets who would go and perform for the Khalifa in Cordoba were women. A lot of them were, not all of them. And you had women who would be great, musicians, not getting into the theological debate on whether or not music is halal or what forms of music are halal in Islam. But there were women musicians at that time. There were many women scientists. The astrolabe, which is kind of like an early GPS before electricity was invented by a woman. So certainly if women are being held back and oppressed in a society, they're not going to be doing those things. So simply the contributions of women at that time is enough proof to show that, women, of course, were not oppressed and that they were seen as a very integral part of society and not just, confined to the home.
Sure. Of course, Muslim Spain did not last. It was there. It was described as one of the most fruitful, if not the most fruitful period of history for Spain. But what happened after that? How did the decline take place?
Well, it's like I mentioned earlier with the kids that are born in the palace, unfortunately. Once they kind of get used to that life of luxury, it's not going to last very long after that. And what happens in Muslim Spain is that we see the Khilafah, the Caliphate of Spain, kind of break up in the mid-1000s, and it develops into something called Ta'ifas. And what a Ta'ifa is basically a small state that's warring with all the other states. So where before you had one giant Muslim kingdom in Spain, what you have now is 15 to 20 different kingdoms that are fighting against each other. And during this time period, the people who are really taking advantage of this unity of the Muslims are the Christians. The northernmost part of the Iberian Peninsula was never conquered by Muslims, and it remained as an independent Christian kingdom. And every time that the Muslims would break up and start fighting against each other, these Christian kingdoms would push a little bit further south and conquer just a little bit more Muslim land. A couple miles here, a couple hundred miles there. And over the course of the 1000s, 1100s, and 1200s, what we see is that these Ta'ifas, these independent Muslim states, one by one were taken over by the northern Christians. And for the most part, however, Muslims were allowed to continue to live there. It was just a transfer of governance from a Muslim government to a Christian government. But what happened is that changed in 1492 when the last Muslim kingdom of Spain, Granada, in the far south of the Iberian Peninsula, was taken over by the Christians, by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who are most famous probably for financing Christopher Columbus to go quote unquote discover the New World. That's another discussion in and of itself.
Sure.
What happens when the last Muslim kingdom of Spain falls is that's when the protection for Muslims is completely taken away. They are forced to either leave, die, or convert. And by the mid-1500s, just 100 years, some years later, we see that there are no Muslims left in Muslim Spain, which is a real travesty because at its height in the 900s and the 1000s, over 80% of the population was Muslim. And these were not people who were transferred in. These were local, Christians who had converted to Islam, people who had accepted Islam, who spoke Spanish as their native language. Ethnically they were Europeans. And when the 1500s and 1600s comes about, they are completely forced out and either forced to convert or die or leave. And by the mid-1500s, early 1600s, there are no Muslims left in Spain.
Mm-hmm. Just very, very briefly, Brother Firas, if you may, because we have run out of time, as is usually the case, what legacy do you think the Muslim contribution to history should leave, and what impact should it have on our young people of today?
I think the legacy is ongoing. If we look at it as saying, there is a legacy of whether it's Muslim Spain or the Crusades, then we're kind of looking at it as something that has ended. And it's certainly not something that has ended. And if we can teach the young people that they are still part of this legacy that is still being made, that will go on from now until the Day of Judgment, it'll give them a sense of responsibility that they need to go out there and create the new Muslim Golden Age. And they need to go out there and recreate the great times that we had in the past. And we need to understand that it's not a legacy per se. It's something that is ongoing, and we are part of that tradition. And we are going to bring back that tradition that we have been talking about throughout this interview.
Brother Firas Alkhateeb, Jazakallah khair, thank you very much for giving up your valuable time to join us this evening and educate us on some of the most fascinating periods of history and how we, as Muslims, have played an imperative role in that.
Well, yeah, it's been a great pleasure talking to you, and I hope that it's been beneficial for all your listeners, inshallah.
It most certainly has. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.